Hi, eighth grade. By now, we have all finished reading The Diary of Anne Frank, and you may be wondering what happened to each of these people after they were caught by the Nazis. This background is an actual photograph of the stairwell of Anne Frank's house, or into the section of hiding that they were in. So in the play, they changed some people's names. They didn't change Anne's family's names at all, but the others, they did alter the name for whatever reason. So, who we know as Mr. Dussel, his real name was Mr. Fritz Pfeffer. I'll continue to call him Mr. Dussel for us, though. And this is a picture of him and what he looked like around the time he would have been in hiding. So, he died on December 20th, 1944, in the Neuengamme concentration camp, which is in Germany. And he wasn't executed. He didn't die by any of the atrocities that the Nazis did to many of the people in these camps. He actually died from enterocolitis, which is the fancy name for a gastrointestinal infection, meaning he died from an infection that was in his gut, like within his intestines. Now, whether that was something that could have been treated or whether that was something that he would have caught by the terrible living conditions, I'm not sure, but he died from an infection in his intestines. Mr. Van Daan, and this is a picture of what he would have looked like. His real name was Mr. Van Pels. He died somewhere in 1944, and that happened in the gas chamber in Auschwitz. So as soon as he was transported and transferred to Auschwitz, he would have been one who they decided upon arrival did not deserve to live, and they would have immediately sent him to the gas chamber in Auschwitz. At this point, all the men had been together, so Mr. Frank, Peter, and Mr. Dussel were still all together and transferred together, so they would have seen and known that he was sent to a gas chamber and died. Mrs. Frank, that's what she looked like prior to um, being sent into hiding. She died somewhere around January 6th of 1945, and she died at the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp. Her cause of death was starvation. So she wasn't executed, she wasn't murdered, similar to Mr. Dussel. She didn't perish to any of the atrocities that the Nazis were doing at the camps. She died from starvation. She was already very, weak and malnourished from her 2 years in hiding, and the food source was even in loss of a supply when they were in the camps. For a very long time, she stayed with her daughters, and so much of what she did receive for food would have been saved for them. So in early January of 1945, she perished to starvation. Mrs. Van Dam, her real name is Mrs. Van Pels. That's what she looked like when they would have arrived in the annex. She died sometime in April or May of 1945. She died during transport, so she died on a train going to the Camp Terrestad. There's no definitive answer or proof. There's no actual record of what caused her death, although people who were alleged witnesses said that the Germans took her and threw her from the train, threw her onto the tracks, and the train went over her and killed her. I don't know if that's ever been proven, but that is what the story is. Peter Van Dam, his real name was Peter Van Pels. He died on May 10th, 1945. And there is no cause of death listed for him, but he was part of the death marches, which you may have learned about with Mr. Gilman. So he survived the death march and he made it to the Camp Mauthausen on January 25th, 1945. So he survived that, where many, many others died and perished along the way. He was young and strong enough that he survived that, but he died on May 10th in that camp. Margot, she died February or March of 1945. Depending on the source you look at, you get a different answer as to actually which month it occurred. And she died in the camp known as Bergen-Belsen. The cause of death for her was typhus fever. Typhus fever is a bacterial infection that is spread by parasites, which would have been prevalent in the camps because of their terrible conditions. And Some of the symptoms of typhus fever are a fever, a headache, and a rash. But this is highly contagious and spreads very quickly in poor living conditions and overcrowded spaces. And the camps were just that. So this was something that was spread, and many people in the camps died from typhus fever. Anne died just shortly thereafter, Margot, of the same condition. She actually contracted typhus fever from Margot. The two of them were able to stay together the entire time, and they shared one little cot, one little bunk together. And Margot's infection spread to Anne. She died very, very, very shortly before the Americans came and liberated the camps. Had she been stronger when she entered the camp, had the Americans gotten there a little sooner, she may very well have lived, but she died very shortly before the Americans were able to liberate her camp. Mr. Frank was the lone survivor. He is the only one of the 8 who spent those 2 years in hiding to survive. And every time I think about him, my heart breaks. I cannot imagine living through what he did. I cannot imagine having to return home knowing your entire family died and all of your friends who you spent those 2 years with. I don't know how he had the courage to live every single day moving forward, but he did. So I included some pictures. This would have been the one on the far left would have been him when they roughly went into hiding. The following picture, you could see him right in here. This is, oops, sorry guys. That was him when he returned to the annex. So that is a picture of him standing alone in the empty annex after he was liberated and returned home. The third picture is a picture of him at the museum. He's a little older there. They turned the annex into the Anne Frank Museum. So I've never been, but Mrs. Pierce has. If you go to Amsterdam and you were to go to um, the annex, it's now turned into a museum and an educational center, and you're able to go and visit and see the space and get a sense of it for yourself. The last picture is a picture of him when he was a little bit older. So after being liberated and after a few years, he couldn't handle living in Amsterdam. It was filled with too many memories. He was too heartbroken. He couldn't like really face another day. So he moved to Switzerland in 1952, and a year later he remarried. A lot of Jewish people remarry rather quickly. Some who were younger did it so that they could continue to like repopulate. They lost a huge, huge majority of the Jewish people on the planet at that time. And so many remarried in order to have children and to keep the Jewish blood going. Some married just so they had companionship and weren't lonely. His wife was a survivor, and like he was, and she already had a daughter who was about Anne's age. Was actually born the same year that Anne was. Mr. Frank, he found Anne's diary, and at first he did not want to publish it. It's a diary, it's personal. Anne said a lot of things in there that maybe she wouldn't have wanted the whole world to know, especially things about the family. But he thought about her and he thought about what she wanted and how she wanted to go on living after her death and all the message that she had to say. And so he did end up publishing it. And there were pages that were removed. So there's some things that maybe she had written about that he did not include in the publication that people get to read. But he did publish that, and he created the museum, and he spent his life dedicated to preserving her memory. And Mr. Frank died on August 19th, 1980. He was 91 years old. And that just amazes me that he lived that many years. And again, I don't know how he was able to open his eyes every day and face a day without his family. I think he's a very strong person for having gone through that and having survived and and just lived on. I don't know if I could have done it. Now, Meep and Mr. Crawler. Meep's name was not changed in the play. Her name is Meep, guys, and it always was. That's a picture of her on the left when she was young and a picture of her later on in life. Um, and then Mr. Collar, his real name was Mr. Kogler. And Meep and Mr. Collar, they were never really persecuted for what they did. They could have easily suffered the same fate as the other 7 who were in hiding who passed it. They could have been sent to a camp, they could have been executed, they could have been tried. They were breaking the laws of their country. But they managed to escape all that. They managed to not suffer any kind of consequence, and they lived and moved on. Meep was very close with Mr. Frank, and even after Mr. Frank's death, she continued to spread Anne's message. Mr. Crawler of these two passed away first. He died on December 16th, 1989 at the age of 81. And Meep, she died January 11th, 2010 at 100 years old. She was almost 101. I believe her birthday was in about a month. Imagine that, 100 years old. Amazing. So, if there's any good thing about having you guys read this without me, it's that I cannot get through the play without crying. And in fact, when I listened to the recordings, those last two scenes, scenes 4 and 5, what you would have read the other day, I was crying like a baby through it. It just breaks me. And when I think about lives that were ended way too early, beautiful souls who didn't get to grow into adulthood, dreams that were shattered. When I think about, millions of people all over the planet who died because of their faith, because of one man's hate, I just have a really hard time with it. And if for nothing else, I hope you guys can walk away knowing that the words we speak have meaning and they have power. Hitler's message of hate had such power that it moved many, many people around the world to believe him and to support him and to help to execute and to create the camps and the Holocaust and everything. And I'm not saying we all have to be each other's best friends, but I do believe that we all need to walk with love and kindness. And we all need to try to practice a little bit of tolerance and acceptance. We don't always have to agree, but we have to agree that we are all people. And as people, we all deserve respect and we all deserve to be cared for. And if nothing else, I hope that's a message you can get from this is our words have power. So let's use that power for good and to spread messages of kindness and tolerance and respect. Goodbye, 8th grade.